When Emma Thompson, 28 years old, housekeeper for 3 years in the millionaire mansion of James Harrison, CEO of Britain's largest record label, accidentally found a forgotten microphone in the drawing room during her morning cleaning, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. She was alone. The mansion was silent, and that melody she'd carried in her heart for years began to flow from her lips. But what James heard when he returned home unexpectedly left him literally paralyzed in the doorway. Because sometimes the purest talent hides where you least expect it. And when Emma began to sing, James's entire musical empire trembled to its foundations. This is the story of how a housekeeper with an angel's voice destroyed and rebuilt the world of a man who thought he'd seen everything. In the magnificent mansion in Kensington, London, each morning began with the same silent routine. Emma Thompson moved between the rooms like an efficient ghost, invisible to the eyes of the master of the house. James Harrison, 45 years old, CEO of Harrison Records, commanded a musical empire that made and broke careers with a single decision. His bespoke suits, his perfectly styled gray hair, the natural authority he exuded, everything about him screamed power and success. But James didn't know that in his own home lived the purest talent he'd ever heard in his life. Emma always sang when she was alone. She sang while ironing, while cooking, while polishing the marble floors. Music was her secret refuge, the only thing that made her forget she was considered just a housekeeper by the world. As a child in Manchester, she dreamed of becoming a singer, but her parents' early death and the necessity of survival had buried those dreams under years of work and responsibility. That October morning, James had left for Edinburgh for a crucial meeting. The mansion, wrapped in elegant silence, offered Emma the freedom to be herself. While dusting the main drawing room, she saw it, a professional microphone forgotten on the crystal table, probably left by an artist after a recording session. She picked it up with reverence, as if it were a sacred object, the familiar weight, the texture she knew from her childhood dreams. Everything reminded her of what could have been. Without realizing it, she began humming a melody she'd composed years earlier, when she still believed everything was possible. The humming transformed into whisper, the whisper into voice, and the voice into something magical that filled the entire mansion. Emma sang with her eyes closed, lost in her music, her heart finally finding outlet after years of forced silence. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the front door open. James had returned unexpectedly to collect some forgotten documents. He stopped at the threshold of the drawing room, paralyzed by what he heard. That voice wasn't just technically perfect. It was pure emotion transformed into sound. It was the soul becoming music. In 20 years of career, he'd heard thousands of voices, launched international stars, but nothing had ever touched him so deeply. It was the voice he'd searched for his entire career without ever finding it, and it had been hidden in his own home for 3 years. When Emma opened her eyes and saw him, the microphone slipped from her trembling hands. Terror and shame filled her gaze, but in James's eyes there was only absolute wonder, as if he'd just witnessed a miracle. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Emma was still trembling, convinced she'd committed a grave violation, while James approached slowly, as if fearing to break a precious spell. With emotion making his voice hoarse, he asked her where she'd learned to sing like that. Emma, her gaze fixed on her feet, murmured that she'd always sung, that her Manchester grandmother told her she had an angel's voice, but that she was just a housekeeper and had never dared dream of more. James picked up the microphone from the floor and offered it to her gently. He asked her to sing again. Anything. With visibly trembling hands, Emma began "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," but her interpretation was something extraordinary. Every note vibrated with lived emotion, with broken dreams, with a beauty born from pain, transformed into art. James, a man accustomed to always maintaining control of his emotions, felt his eyes moisten. It wasn't just the technical perfection of that voice. It was the soul that shone through every note. It was the authenticity that no singing school could teach. When he learned that Emma had worked in his mansion for 3 years, without him suspecting her talent, and that she'd never tried to become a singer because she was convinced dreams didn't pay bills, James realized he was facing something irreplaceable. Not just an extraordinary voice, but a story the public would adore. His musical entrepreneur mind began elaborating possibilities at dizzying speed. The housekeeper with the golden voice, the hidden talent discovered by chance in his own home, it was a story that wrote itself. But something deeper was happening. While looking at Emma, James felt reigniting a passion he thought he'd lost years earlier in business cynicism. That voice reminded him why he'd started making music. Not for money or power, but for the pure beauty of art. When he told her everything could change, that she could become Britain's greatest singer, he saw in her eyes for the first time in years a spark of hope. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change both their lives forever. James paced nervously around the drawing room, his mind elaborating infinite possibilities. That voice, that emotional purity were exactly what the music market was seeking without knowing it. When Emma protested shyly that she knew nothing about the professional world, he stopped her. What she possessed couldn't be taught. It was a gift born with her. He immediately called Oliver Hartwell, Britain's most respected producer. The man arrived skeptical, but when he heard Emma sing, his expression changed in seconds. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, and when she finished, he remained in absolute silence. Oliver, a veteran who'd worked with Adele and Ed Sheeran, whispered in disbelief that he'd never heard anything like it in 30 years of career. With that voice, he said, a week was enough for a demo. But he warned, the music world was ruthless for someone coming from nowhere. For the first time, Emma raised her gaze with firm determination. I've lived in the shadows all my life. If I can make the world hear my voice, I want to try. James smiled. He'd found his star. In a week, the mansion transformed into a recording studio. The elegant drawing room filled with microphones and mixing boards, while Emma underwent the most incredible metamorphosis. Gone was the housekeeper's uniform. Gone was the strict ponytail. Now she wore jeans and t-shirts, hair loose, eyes shining with a never-before-seen light. Oliver trained her for hours, making her discover vocal nuances she didn't even know she possessed. James watched fascinated at the daily transformation. Not only was the voice growing, but she was blooming as a person, shyness giving way to natural confidence. The magical moment arrived with Beyond the Stars, the ballad Oliver wrote for her. It spoke of hidden dreams and rebirth. Emma's story transformed into music. When she interpreted it, James felt chills. She was singing her autobiography, infusing pure emotion into every word. Oliver declared the take perfect, incredulous at the magic he'd just captured. James announced that in 2 days, the demo would go to radio stations, forever changing Emma's life. But while speaking, he realized his existence was also changing. Watching Emma rediscover herself reminded him of the pure love for music he thought he'd lost. Wednesday morning at 8:30, BBC Radio 1 broadcast Beyond the Stars for the first time. James and Emma, too nervous to breakfast, listened with hearts pounding in the mansion's kitchen. When Emma's voice filled the kitchen through the radio, she covered her face, overwhelmed. It was truly her voice reaching thousands of British homes. The reaction was overwhelming. James's phone rang incessantly. Oliver announced social media was exploding with 5,000 shares in half an hour. BBC Radio 1 declared their switchboard was exploding with requests. All national radio stations were calling for information about this mysterious Emma Thompson. By afternoon, Beyond the Stars was viral everywhere. The comments unanimous. Everyone wanted to know who this incredible voice was. The emergency meeting at Harrison Records was chaotic. Sarah announced dizzying numbers, national trending topic in 24 hours, Spotify calling for exclusive interviews, even Eurovision interested. Emma paled hearing about the contest, but when James asked if she was ready, she answered honestly, "I don't know if I'm ready, but if Britain wants to hear my voice, I'll sing." That evening, James announced her television debut. The next day, she'd be on The Jonathan Ross Show, before 5 million viewers. All of Britain was about to know her. Backstage at The Jonathan Ross Show pulsed with frantic activity. Emma sat in the makeup chair, hands visibly trembling while the makeup artist gave final touches. James stood beside her, trying to transmit calm through his presence alone. But he too was nervous about what this evening represented. When she confessed her fear of 5 million viewers who would judge her, James reassured her gently, reminding her that all those people were waiting to fall in love with her voice, exactly as had happened to him days earlier. Jonathan Ross entered the dressing room with that reassuring smile that made him beloved across the country. After introducing himself, he confided a trade secret. All the best artists he'd interviewed in years of career were always terrified before taking the stage. Fear meant it truly mattered to her, and that was a good sign. He asked what she thought about when singing, and Emma closed her eyes a moment before answering. She thought of her grandmother, who'd always told her that music was the soul's universal language, and that if you sing with your heart, you reach straight to the heart of anyone listening. Jonathan smiled, immediately understanding he had an authentic person before him. He told her to think exactly of her grandmother when she took the stage, to sing with her heart, and everything else would come naturally. 15 minutes later, Emma found herself on the stage of Britain's most famous television studio. The lights were blinding, cameras pointed at her like cannons, the audience in religious silence. The emotion was so intense, she thought for a moment she couldn't speak. But Jonathan masterfully guided her through her story. Emma told of the Manchester grandmother, childhood dreams, the necessity of working as a housekeeper, James discovering her by chance with a forgotten microphone. She spoke of how life can change in an instant when you least expect it, when fate decides to knock on your door. The studio audience was completely captivated. You couldn't hear a pin drop. Every person concentrated on this girl, telling such an authentic and moving story. When the moment came to sing Beyond the Stars,
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Emma took the microphone and closed her eyes. For an instant, everything disappeared. Cameras, audience, pressure. There were only she, her voice, and the memory of her grandmother smiling from heaven. She began to sing, and that magic only great art can create occurred. Her voice filled the studio, but also the sitting rooms of millions of Britons glued to their televisions. It was powerful, but delicate. Technically perfect, but deeply human. Professional, but incredibly authentic. When the last note faded in silence, there were a few seconds of total suspension. Then, the audience exploded in applause that seemed never to want to end, an ovation that made the studio walls tremble. Jonathan had moist eyes with emotion, and James, too, watching from the wings, wiped away a tear. It had been more than a simple performance. It was pure art transmitted live nationally. Social media reactions were immediate and devastating. Emma Thompson became a worldwide trending topic in minutes. Comments multiplied by thousands per second, all unanimously enthusiastic. But the one that most struck James came from Elton John, who tweeted a welcome message to the great family of British music. That evening officially marked the birth of a star, and Britain had fallen hopelessly in love. 3 months after that television evening that had forever changed her existence, Emma Thompson had become the most disruptive musical phenomenon Britain had seen in 20 years. Beyond the Stars had remained firmly at the top of all charts for 10 consecutive weeks. The album Rebirth had sold over 1 million copies in the first month, and tickets for her concerts sold out in minutes. But extraordinary success had brought with it a price no one had foreseen or considered. In the luxurious penthouse in central London that James had given her, Emma looked with melancholic expression at newspaper headlines scattered on the table. Emma Thompson, music's Cinderella, from mop to microphone. The British miracle. The housekeeper who conquered the world. She could no longer leave home without being besieged by hordes of paparazzi and fans. The day before, a simple attempt to go shopping had turned into a nightmare with 20 photographers following her down the street. Her private life had become public property, every movement scrutinized and commented upon. James, who came to see her every evening, immediately noticed the changes. In 3 months, Emma was physically different, thinner, with pronounced dark circles, and most importantly, she'd lost that spontaneous and luminous smile that had conquered him the first day. She seemed a faded version of herself. When he proposed slowing the pace, postponing the European tour that was already sold out, Emma categorically refused. She didn't want to disappoint the thousands of people who'd placed their trust in her. Every day, she received hundreds of letters from girls writing that her story had inspired them not to abandon their own dreams. But James understood something profound had broken when he asked if she was living her dreams or just enduring them. Emma sadly admitted she sometimes missed the mansion's silence when she sang only for him and Oliver. Everything had been purer, more authentic, before the media circus. The final straw came when Sarah called euphorically announcing that Quincy Jones, Hollywood's most important music producer, wanted to produce an English album for her. It was the opportunity every artist dreamed of, the gateway to the global market. But instead of the excitement James expected, he saw in Emma's eyes only deep fatigue and resignation. She'd become a machine that had to say yes to everything. She'd lost control of her own artistic life. James made a drastic decision. He turned off Emma's phone and announced that tomorrow they'd leave, just the two of them, without managers, without journalists, without phones. The trip to Manchester was liberating. On the train, Emma wore dark glasses and a hat, but for the first time in months she seemed relaxed. She looked at the landscape passing by the window and hummed softly a melody he'd never heard before. Something being born spontaneously from her free heart. In the neighborhood where she'd grown up, in front of the small house with blue shutters where she'd lived with her grandmother, Emma stopped emotionally. She didn't want to go inside, but decided to do something symbolic. Sing there, for her grandmother, for her roots, to remember who she really was. She stood in the center of the small square, among playing children and women hanging laundry. She closed her eyes and began singing that melody improvised on the train, without words, just pure emotion transformed into sound. The neighborhood people stopped to listen. Children stopped playing. People leaned out windows. But there were no cameras, no journalists, no business. There were only people listening to a beautiful voice resonating in a Manchester square, as had happened for centuries in British musical tradition. An elderly man approached at the end and complimented her angelic voice. Emma smiled, and James realized it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in months. Returning to the station, Emma made a decision that would change everything again. She wanted to do things differently. Less television, fewer interviews, less media circus. She wanted to focus only on music, on the purity of art she'd rediscovered in that Manchester square. James warned her she'd probably lose lots of money and opportunities, but Emma responded with determination that she'd rather gain her soul. At that moment, James understood he was hopelessly in love with this brave woman who'd chosen authenticity above all. A year after that revolutionary trip to Manchester that had redefined their priorities, Emma and James sat in the same drawing room where everything had begun. But now the space had taken on a completely different meaning. It was no longer the elegant drawing room of a luxury mansion where master and housekeeper lived. but the beating heart of the home they shared as a couple in love. Emma had made brave decisions for her career. She'd refused Hollywood's temptations and millionaire offers, choosing instead a unique artistic path. Intimate concerts in Britain's historic theaters, albums recorded in the mansion's tranquility with Oliver, and most importantly, she'd opened a completely free singing school for young people without financial means. Her fame hadn't diminished, but had acquired a deeper and more respected dimension. She'd become a symbol of authenticity in an often superficial music world, an example of how one could succeed while staying true to one's own values. Nestled in James's arms on their sofa, Emma confessed a truth that surprised her every day. She regretted nothing from her past, not even the days when she was simply his housekeeper. Because if she hadn't lived that life of invisibility, James would never have accidentally discovered her voice, and she would never have discovered the love of her life. James revealed the philosophy he'd developed through their shared experience. True success in life didn't consist of selling millions of records or filling enormous stadiums, but finding someone who loved you for what you really were, beyond what the world saw or projected onto you. In a spontaneous gesture, Emma got up and went to the piano James had bought her. She began playing a sweet and melancholic melody he'd never heard before. She explained she'd written this song thinking of him, and it was simply titled Home. While she sang verses about how she'd never known what it really meant to be home until she found him, how every day of their life together had become a melody, James felt his eyes fill with tears of emotion. When the song ended in the emotionally charged silence, James reached her at the piano, declaring it was the most beautiful composition she'd ever created. Emma smiled, explaining it was so authentic because it was completely true. Then, with a spontaneity that caught him completely off guard, Emma asked him to marry her. She wanted a simple and intimate ceremony, right there in the drawing room where everything had begun. No journalists, no cameras, no media circus, just them, Oliver as witness, and perhaps Father William from the little neighborhood church. James, still shocked by the unexpected proposal, objected jokingly about their 15-year age difference and the complexity of his past. But Emma replied wisely that she was a former housekeeper who'd become a singer by pure chance, and he was an entrepreneur who'd rediscovered love through music. They were both impossible and imperfect, and that's exactly why they were perfect together. 2 months later, they celebrated the wedding exactly as Emma had dreamed. A simple and moving ceremony in the mansion's garden, surrounded only by dearest friends. Emma wore a white dress chosen from a small London shop, refusing proposals from famous designers. Oliver played Beyond the Stars, while she walked through the garden to reach James. During the ceremony, when Father William asked James if he wanted to take Emma as his lawful wife, he answered with his heart in his hand that he'd wanted her since he first heard her sing. And when it was Emma's turn, she declared she'd wanted him since he'd made her understand her voice had inestimable value. That evening, while they danced slowly in the garden under a starry sky, James whispered in Emma's ear what would be his favorite part of their whole story when they told it to grandchildren: finding the love of his life in his own home, living under the same roof for 3 years, without ever noticing. Emma burst into that pure and crystalline laughter that had conquered him from the first day, confessing she'd always tell of finding the man who'd believed in her most impossible dreams when not even she believed in them anymore. While they continued dancing embraced, they heard warm applause from surrounding buildings. It was the whole neighborhood that had appeared at windows and balconies to applaud their Emma's wedding. There were no paparazzi or gossip magazines capturing the moment. There were only ordinary people celebrating authentic love with sincere joy. The housekeeper, who'd accidentally found a microphone and started singing, had discovered something even more precious than worldwide fame. She'd found her true home in the heart of the man who'd believed in her when everything seemed impossible. If Emma and James's story has made your heart beat, and made you believe that the most beautiful dreams are born when you least expect them. Smash that like button with all your strength and share this magic. Show the world you still believe in miracles of love and hidden talent. Tell us in the comments, what's the secret dream you keep locked in your heart's drawer? Have you ever thought your talent was too small for the world? Emma has shown us it's never too late to shine. Your comments could inspire someone to believe in themselves. Subscribe immediately and turn on all notifications so you won't miss any other extraordinary stories of people who transformed their lives when everything seemed impossible. Is your heart still beating strong? Click on any video on the screen now and dive into other incredible tales of love, realized dreams, and second chances that will make you believe again in life's magic.